Hi again everyone, and welcome to the last video for the David Armstrong reading, The Nature of Mind. In this section we're going to see Armstrong deal with what he subtitles as the problem of consciousness. So this is the issue of, whatever we're consciously aware of at any given time, and how this sort of differs from his conception of the mind so far. Remember in the last recording, or the last part of the reading, he defined the mind as an inner state apt for producing a certain range of behaviors. Consciousness, or the experience of consciousness, what we've talked about as being qualia in class, is a little bit different to this, and so Armstrong is now going to deal with this sort of final problem of the mind. It's worth noting that qualia is sort of still the great hope of the dualists, as evidence that the mind is non-physical. So we'll see how Armstrong deals with this. I'll be going from on the left side of the page, it's page 11, and the subheading, The Problem of Consciousness. Here we're going to see Armstrong dealing with the problem of automatism, that sensation where you're doing something without actually thinking about doing it. And he identifies that that feeling where you sort of come to and kind of wake up to what you're doing. And he's going to define this as simply an inner sense or a self-scanning mechanism of the central nervous system, I believe is the term that he uses. So in other words, this is just like sight or hearing, this is just a sense of your central nervous system, of what you are thinking about at any given time. Now, does this mean that there's no non-physical mind? No, just like all of the rest of Armstrong's argument, it doesn't mean that the dualist argument is wrong. It just means that the physicalist argument, or the materialist argument, is possible. And remember, his position is we should be going with the materialist argument because it's what science is leaning towards at the moment. So here we go. Pens at the ready. The problem of consciousness. Along these lines, then, I would look for an account of the mind that is compatible with a purely materialist theory of man. There are, as may be imagined, all sorts of powerful objections that can be made to my view. But in the rest of this paper, I propose to do only one thing. I will develop one very important objection to my view of the mind, an objection felt by many philosophers, and then try to show how the objection should be met. So he's basically saying the rest of this essay he's going to deal with a rebuttal. The view that our notion of mind is nothing but that of an inner principle apt for bringing about certain sorts of behavior may be thought to share a certain weakness with behaviorism. Modern philosophers have put the point about behaviorism by saying that although behaviorism may be a satisfactory account of the mind from an other-person point of view, it will not do as a first-person account. So we have discussed this a little bit already. Hopefully you know what Armstrong means by this idea of a first person versus a third person, but just a very quick recap. The third person account is when you're dealing with other people, and if you think about it, you can't read anyone else's mind, you can only read their behavior. Their behavior, though, gives you some impression about what they're thinking about. The first person account is your own experience of your mind and your consciousness, and this is very different. You know that there is something going on inside your head, or wherever it is, and it's very real. Like, this isn't just an idea, you do experience it. And so this is the big difference between the first person and the third person account. So continuing on, to explain, in my encounters with other people, all I ever observe is their behavior, their actions, their speech, and so on. And so if we simply consider other people, behaviorism might seem to do full justice to the facts. But the trouble about behaviorism is that it seems so unsatisfactory as applied to our own case. In our own case, we seem to be aware of so much more than mere behavior. So again, the behaviorist account doesn't really work for the first person view of mind. Suppose that now we conceive of the mind as an inner principle apt for bringing about certain sorts of behaviour. This again fits the other person case very well. Bodily behaviour of a very sophisticated sort is observed, quite different from the behaviour that ordinary physical objects display. It is inferred that this behaviour must spring from a very special sort of inner cause in the object that exhibits this behaviour. This inner cause is christened the mind, and those who take a physicalist view of man argue that it is simply the central nervous system of the body observed. So this idea, that the mind is in a state apt for producing a certain range of behaviour works in the third person, because when I see you doing something, so for example, when I see you writing an essay, well, this is a very complex behaviour, and I'd be silly to think that there wasn't something going on inside you that is helping you to formulate, to formulate the arguments that you're writing down in your essay. Okay, so that's what Armstrong is pointing out here, that the mind, his conception of the mind, his definition, does work for the third person account. Compare this with the case of glass. Certain characteristic behaviour is observed, the breaking and shattering of the material when acted upon by relatively small forces. A special inner state of the glass is postulated to explain this behaviour. Those who take a purely physicalist view of glass then argue that this state is a material state of the glass. It is perhaps an arrangement of the molecules, and not, say, the peculiarly malevolent disposition of the demons that dwell in the glass. So Armstrong is being very tongue-in-cheek here and really having a shot at the dualists. Basically, he's saying that if we see glass break, we don't look at it and go, oh, it must have been the demons that are in the glass that allowed it to break. When we see glass break, what we should go is, there must be something about the molecular structure of glass that allows it to break so easily. He's sort of saying we should do the same with humans. When we see someone doing something complex, like writing an essay, we shouldn't say, the little person inside that human must be working very hard to get that human to write an essay. We should look at the person writing an essay and go, they must have thoughts running through their head that allow them to write that essay. No need for a ghost in the machine. But when we turn to our own case, the position may seem less plausible. We are conscious. We have experiences. Now, can we say that to be conscious, to have experiences, is simply for something to go on within us apt for the causing of certain sorts of behaviour? Such an account does not seem to do any justice to the phenomenon. So Armstrong here is talking about what we now call qualia, the sensation of consciousness. The inner monologue or the inner movie that's running through your head at any given time. It is what you are thinking about at any given moment. And so it seems that our account of the mind, like behaviorism, will fail to do justice to the first person case. So this definition, an inner state apt for producing a certain range of behaviour, is fine, except for the first person account, because we know that our experience of consciousness is as something more than simply an inner state apt for producing certain range of behaviour. Okay, it is more than that. It is very real to us, our consciousness, and so this definition doesn't seem right. So in order to understand the objection better, it may be helpful to consider a particular case. If you have driven for a very long distance without a brake, you may have had experience of a curious state of automatism, which can occur in these conditions. One can suddenly come to and realize that one has driven for a long distance without being aware of what one was doing, or indeed without being aware of anything. One has kept the car on the road, used the brake and the clutch perhaps, yet all without any awareness of what one was doing. There's lots of ones in this. I'm not a huge fan of people who use one, like what one was doing. It's a little bit wanky. Don't be one of those people. Anyway, Armstrong is. And where he's talking about this, if you haven't experienced it driving, I'm sure that, any mundane task that you do, so if you, have to mow the lawns, or if you mop the floor or whatever, then you've probably experienced this. And what we're talking about is that autopilot that you can go into. So you're just sort of mopping the floor. But the lights aren't on. You keep moving and you're mopping all of the floor. You get everything, but no one's behind the curtain at this point. So now, if we consider this case, it is obvious that in some sense mental processes are still going on when one is in such an automatic state. Unless one's will was still operating in some way, and unless one was still perceiving in some way, the car would not still be on the road. Yet, so what he's saying here is something's going on, otherwise the car would end up in a ditch. But you've applied the brake, you've changed gears, you've indicated, you've stopped at stop signs. So there's perception and understanding going on, but there's no conscious awareness of that going on. Yet, of course, something mental is lacking. Now, I think when it is alleged that an account of mind as an inner principle apt for the production of a certain sort of behavior leaves out consciousness or experience, what is alleged to have been left out is just whatever is missing in the automatic driving case. It is conceded that an account of mental processes as states of the person apt for the production of certain sorts of behavior very possibly may be adequate to deal with such cases as that of automatic driving. It may be adequate to deal with most of the mental processes of animals, which perhaps spend most of their lives in this state of automatism. But it is contended it cannot deal with the consciousness that we normally enjoy. So he's just pointing out here that, okay, the definition he's got of mind, this, an inner state apt, etc., it just can't deal with qualia, the problem of qualia, that sensation of consciousness that we have. Okay. I will now try to sketch an answer to this important and powerful objection. Let us begin in an apparently unlikely place, and consider the way that an account of mental processes of the sort I am giving would deal with sense perception. So he's saying, okay, well, let's stop for a moment. Let's think about the way that we perceive other things, like, our five senses. Now, psychologists in particular have long realized that there is a very close logical tie between sense perception and selective behavior. Suppose we wanted to decide whether an animal can perceive the difference between red and green. We might give the animal a choice between two pathways, over one of which a red light shines and over the other of which a green light shines. If the animal happens by chance to choose the green pathway, we reward it. If it happens to choose the other pathway, we do not reward it. If after some trials the animal systematically takes the green lighted pathway, and if we become assured that the only relevant difference in the two pathways are the differences in the color of the lights, we are entitled to say that the animal can see this color difference. Using its eyes, it selects between red lighted and green lighted pathways. So we say it can see the difference between red and green. It's a very long section where we're discussing how to test for color blindness. Moving on. Now, a behaviorist would be tempted to say that the animal's regular selection of the green lighted pathway was its perception of the color difference. But this is unsatisfactory, because we all want to say that perception is something that goes on within the person or animal, within its mind. Although, of course, this mental event is normally caused by the operation of the environment upon the organism. So, the behaviorist would say that let's say the rat can perceive color difference, and that is the behavior that we're seeing. That's not how we experience seeing color, for example. We don't experience color as the behavior we exhibit when we see that color. We experience color as an internal state, and so that's sort of what Armstrong is saying here. So suppose, however, that we speak instead of capacities for selective behavior towards the current environment, and suppose we think of these capacities like dispositions, as actual inner states of the organism. We can then think of the animal's perception as a state within the animal apt, if the animal is so impelled, for selective behavior between the red and green lighted pathways. So what is color vision? Well, it is an inner state apt for producing a certain range of behavior if you would like to in response to that color. A good example for us of this would be a red light. When we see a red light, there is an inner state that occurs, an inner perception, that knows that we are supposed to stop. Now, we're not destined to stop. We're not guaranteed to stop. We do still, we are impelled to stop by the red. Okay, we know what it means, but we still get to choose. Okay, so maybe this is, what consciousness is. In general, we can think of perceptions as inner states or events apt for the production of certain sorts of selective behavior towards our environment. So this is Armstrong's definition of sensory perception, so our 5 senses. To perceive is like acquiring a key to a door. You do not have to use the key. You can put it in your pocket and never bother about the door. But if you do want to open the door, the key may be essential. The blind man is a man who does not acquire certain keys and, as a result, is not able to operate in his environment in the way that somebody who has his sight can operate. It seems then a very promising view to take of perception that they are inner states defined by the sorts of selective behavior that they enable the perceiver to exhibit, if so impelled. What are we talking about here? That perception is, as Armstrong says, it's like a key to a door. Now, if you're blind, then you don't have that key, and so you can't access that perception. Assuming you've got all 5 of your senses, well, you've got all 5 keys. Doesn't mean you have to use them all the time. You could ignore what someone says or put earplugs in. You could close your eyes so that you don't see something. You can choose not to use the keys, but they are a capability or a capacity that allow you to operate in your environment. Okay. Now, how is this discussion of perception related to the question of consciousness or experience? The sort of thing that the driver who is in a state of automatism has not got, but which we normally do have. Simply this. My proposal is that consciousness, in this sense of the word, is nothing but perception or awareness of the state of your own mind. So, there's a great definition there that Armstrong gives for what he sees consciousness as. It is nothing but perception or awareness of the state of our own mind. The driver is in a state of automatism. The driver in a state of automatism perceives or is aware of the road. If he did not, the car would be in a ditch. But he is not currently aware of his awareness of the road. He perceives the road, but he does not perceive his perceiving, or anything else that is going on in his mind. He is not, as we normally are, conscious of what is going on in his mind. So most of the time when you're trying to achieve a task, that sort of fills your mind. Okay, you are focused on that task. That's what you're dealing with. When you're doing something really mundane, like say mopping the floor, you don't have to focus on that task. Your body can kind of go into autopilot and you'll just keep doing it. And then your mind will wander. It might wander in strange directions, or it might kind of turn off and you'll just sort of stop thinking altogether. That's what Armstrong is talking about here. In this case, it is really just a form of perception. The same way as you can close your eyes so that you don't see, Armstrong is saying, well, sometimes we close our inner eye and we can't see what our mind is doing, or our consciousness. And so I conceive of consciousness or experience in this sense of the word, in the way that Locke and Kant conceived it, as like perceptions, or this internal sense, this sixth sense. Kant, in a striking phrase, spoke of inner sense. We cannot directly observe the minds of others, but each of us has the power to observe directly our own minds and perceive what is going on there. The driver in the automatic state is one whose inner eye is shut, who is not currently aware of what is going on in his own mind. Now, if this account is along the right lines, why should we not give an account of this inner observation along the same lines as we have already given of perception? So just to pause for a moment. The last paragraph, Armstrong clarifies things. He says, I'm following in the tradition of Locke and Kant, who both saw our consciousness as this idea of like an inner sense or an inner perception. We've gotten a reference to like an inner eye, not physically obviously, but that idea. Now what Armstrong is going to do is say, okay, well, how should we try to explain this inner eye or this inner sense? Should we include an element of magic, or should we accept that there's no magic involved? It's very simple, much like our other perceptions. So, why should we not conceive of it as an inner state, a state in this case directed towards other inner states, and not to the environment, which enables us, if we are so impelled, to behave in a selective way towards our own states of minds. One who is aware or conscious of his thoughts or his emotions is one who has the capacity to make discriminations between his different mental states. His capacity might be exhibited in words. He might say that he was in an angry state of mind, when and only when he was in an angry state of mind. But such verbal behavior would be the mere expression or result of the awareness. The awareness itself would be an inner state, the sort of inner state that gave the man a capacity for such behavioral expressions. So, think of the emotion that you're experiencing right now. Okay? What allowed you to perceive that emotion? That was your inner sense, your inner eye. Okay? Now, with you perceiving that emotion, you might be apt for producing a certain range of behavior. If you're bored and you're getting over it, you might stop the video. If you are engaged and enjoying it, which I'm sure you all are, you might decide to play the video over again. I'm sure. Back to back. Why not? And so this inner sense is what allows you to be aware of it. Some of you may be so bamboozled or so kind of tired while you're listening to this that you're not actually paying attention to anything that I've said. You may be in a state of automatism. You're looking at the book and you're highlighting words as you go, but none of it's actually going in. You're going to have to do this recording again. Okay? In this case, your inner eye is closed. You are still perceiving with your other senses, but your inner eye is closed. So, I have argued that consciousness is our own mental state. Consciousness of our own mental state may be assimilated to perception of our own mental state, and that, like other perceptions, it may be then conceived of as an inner state or event, giving a capacity for selective behavior. In this case, selective behavior towards our own mental state. All this is meant to be simply a logical analysis of consciousness, and none of it entails, although it does not rule out, a purely physicalist account of what these inner states are. So once again, Armstrong is pointing out here that all he's doing is providing an explanation, the logical explanation for what consciousness is perceived to be. Does this mean that the physicalist account is correct? No, not necessarily. Could there be a ghost in the machine? Yes. But it's not necessary. He's providing an explanation that fits with a purely materialist view of mankind. Why would we overcomplicate it with adding in a non-physical element? Okay? But if we are convinced on general scientific grounds that a purely physical account of man is likely to be the true one, then there seems to be no bar to our identifying these inner states with purely physical states of the central nervous system. And so consciousness of our own mental state becomes simply the scanning of one part of our central nervous system by another. And this last line is a good definition for this section. Consciousness is a self-scanning mechanism of the central nervous system. So it is an inner sense of the central nervous system. As I have emphasized before, I have done no more than sketch a program for philosophy of mind. There are all sorts of expansions and elucidations to be made, and all sorts of doubts and difficulties to be stated and overcome. But I hope I have done enough to show that a purely physicalist theory of the mind is an exciting and plausible intellectual option. So Armstrong here saying, look, he hasn't proven physicalism. All that he's done is shown that physicalism is possible. This sort of frees us from the tyranny of dualism. No longer do we have to be dualists. He's saying physicalism or materialism is a very real option. Okay, so look, that brings us to the end of the reading. In your books there's the postscript. It's pretty straightforward. If you've got any questions about it, let me know. I'm not even sure it's part of the reading anymore. I thought I'd throw it in because it used to be. But I hope that you found this interesting. It's a very different view of how we exist from Descartes and Plato. And so, yeah, Armstrong has given us an account of our existence that doesn't require some form of magic, or, as I've said before, some ghost in the machine. Maybe we are just physical beings, and that's it. Alright, so let that marinate for a little bit, and I'll see you in class. Let's see if your inner eye is open when we're talking about this in class. I'll see you later. Bye.